Hey there, everybody. Thank you for watching. As always, I really appreciate it. I believe, and I would imagine most of you would probably agree, that at the heart of most every woodworking shop, you would find a nice sturdy workbench and a table saw. So for those of you who might be earlier on in this journey of enjoying woodworking as a hobby, or maybe you're not, but woodworking is about sharing ideas and best practices, so to speak. Whatever the case might be, I thought that it was time now to do an episode on what I think are the 10 essential things or knowledge points you might want to keep in mind when operating a table saw in your shop in order to assure the best results. Good accuracy, good precision, and above all, good safety. So that's what this video is about. Again, thank you for watching. Okay, so my first suggestion is this right here. I would suggest getting an apron or something like this. Doesn't have to be leather or anything special. This is quite old. I got this many years ago at a woodworking show. And the reason being, it's not just for looks, but the hide, the leather hide in this case that this apron was made out of is certainly tougher than my hide. So, when you're working on a table saw, even though I'll get into how to avoid this, you won't eliminate the chance that things might fly back at you. And I'd rather have a piece of wood hit this than my body or t-shirt. So that's the first suggestion I would make, is get some sort of apron. And also, I have dust collection on this table saw and whatnot, but, dust does fly. And so it'll help with that. I don't use my apron to attach a lot of things. I just don't do that. Certainly don't want things falling onto the table saw. But again, I got this apron years ago for that reason primarily, is so that should something fly off the table and back at my body, I have safety glasses on, and I try to avoid standing in front of the blade. And again, I'll get into that. But having an apron like this is helpful. Okay, the next thing I will offer, and I alluded to this just now, is stance. You want to avoid standing, for obvious reasons, right in line with the blade when the saw is on. Obviously, when you're lining up your cut, you're standing right over it, you're looking at the blade and whatnot, you're getting things ready. But once that saw goes on, if you're using a miter fence, you want to be on this side of it. You can obviously handle the piece as you need to guide it through the cutting process. And likewise, if you're ripping, you want to be on this side of it, again, guiding the piece as necessary, or even like this on the side. But again, you want to avoid your head being in the line of sight of the blade for obvious reasons. And again, that's why I suggested the apron. If something does tend to fly off and fly at you, you don't want it hitting your head. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is blade height. You want to set the height of the blade, and this is applicable for both rip cuts or cross cuts. You want to set the blade height to just above the surface of the wood that you're cutting. So in this case, what I tend to kind of go for is about a half a sawtooth above the surface of the blade. Again, that's for both rip cuts and cross cuts. That's going to give you your safest and best cut. All right? So regardless of the stock, again, just adjust the height to about half a sawtooth for your safest and best cut. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about really goes in line with blade height is the number of teeth you want cutting the wood at any one time. You really want no more than 3 to 5 teeth cutting the wood at one time. That's going to give you, keeping within that rule of thumb is going to give you your best and safest cut. So in this case here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 teeth would be cutting this wood at one time. That's okay. And this is basically a combination blade that I have in this saw. If you get beyond that, and perhaps you've already experienced this, the wood starts heating up, you're starting to see smoke. You're really getting into an unsafe situation that is unsettling at best. So to avoid that, again, if you're using thicker stock, you might want to go with something like this. This is a 24 tooth rip blade, and I'm talking more about ripping here, obviously. That you might want to go with something like this if you're going to be, again, ripping thicker stock where you're going to get beyond that 3 to 5 tooth cutting at one time rule of thumb. Again, I definitely use this. And also, even though you would tend to, let's say you're doing a glue up, you're ripping boards to make a tabletop you're going to be gluing up later. This type of blade, even though you might want to still join the stock before you make the glue up, let's say if you don't have a joiner, this type of blade will leave a really good glue line for you to use after ripping. So, much better than if you use like a combination blade on something thick. Again, you're not going to get the heating, the smoking, and that whole thing with something like this on thicker stock. Unnecessary on smaller boards, but thicker stock, I'd use something like this. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is rip cuts. And this topic will have several subsections. The first one is, obviously, you cut in one direction. And I will admit, at least for cross cuts, I might get lazy sometimes and do this thing. That's a bad idea. You really want to cut in one direction. But again, getting back to this focus of rip cuts, so that, as you push the wood over the cutting surface, and I'm exaggerating, think of this motion. You want this piece to go away, and you want that piece to go away. That's why the splitter is there. So that if wood does tend to touch the back of the blade, even with the splitter, you can get wood coming to fly back at you, which again you don't want, which is why you have the apron. But you don't want to have to need the apron. So again, you want to avoid the wood touching, or you want to avoid any cutting activity happening beyond this point here. That's where the cutting happens. Keep the splitter on. I know some people, I've seen it before, it amazes me personally. They'll remove this, I don't know why, but I would never cut without that on. And yeah, again, you want to avoid wood touching the back of the blade. Again, to exaggerate, think of this motion. All right? Okay, the next thing is, let's say that you're cutting a board like this. You're cutting a piece of plywood or something like this that's, a little big. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. What you want to do after you go across the blade and you do your cut, don't lift your work back over the running blade. You want to push the waste side away and lift this around the blade. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Again, it might seem small, but you can imagine you get distracted, you're not thinking something weird, and man, that's a bad situation waiting to happen. So once I get done, I lift it around the blade, not over the blade. Okay, the next thing I want to mention, that let's say you're cutting something thick, and I tell you, I don't know if you've ever worked with alder. Alder is the worst for this, I think, although I've experienced this with maple, cherry, everything. Just a weird piece of wood. You're cutting a big piece of wood, you're ripping it, and then at the back, the wood starts to come back together, and it feels like it wants to bind. I had this happen before, and it can stop the saw blade. If that ever happens to you and you're doing a rip cut and you see it happening, and you'll know, slow down. Just go slow. Even stop the cutting process, inch it along like this. Slow. So that as that wood is binding in, you're going to get some burning if this happens, but you don't want to go back. And if the blade hasn't stopped yet, I've kept going, but again, I slow down so that the blade can cut its way through the thick stock. Let me put it that way. Now, when you get done, you're going to see burning. It's not going to be a great cut. You're going to have to probably join. You're going to have to join that piece and do it again. And that's why when you're doing something like this, you want to ease into, if you're cutting something, whatever you're cutting, I know for me, this is kind of getting off subject, especially a wood where I think this could happen. I don't like measure the width I need or whatever and cut it exactly to that. I'll ease into it to see how the wood's going to behave as I'm getting closer to the size that I want. So again, for what I want to say here though, if you're ever cutting like that and you see that board start to bind and smoke, it's getting hot, slow down and just inch the wood over a little bit at a time until you get past the cut. But if that, you don't get that opportunity and the wood binds and stops the blade, wherever you're at, hold that blade in place and cut the saw off. And when the saw stops running, move the fence out of the way, do whatever you have to do to get that piece unbound. Okay, so next thing I'm going to talk about is push sticks, or devices you might use to advance a piece of wood past the cutting surface. And I'll talk about, I have a couple of different ones here that I use. I'll talk about these later. First, let me talk about these type of push sticks that I'm sure most of you have seen or probably already use. In fact, this one came with my table saw. And if you can get this in focus, you can see that, let's see here, it's already served its purpose on a couple of occasions. But anyway, push sticks. And I've made a little demo here, a presentation aid to help make my point. Let's say you're cutting a piece like this across your table saw, and you want to use a push stick. You plan on using a push stick to advance the workpiece. If you can see it here. What you want to do in this situation is you want to position the push stick just to the left of center of what you're trying to cut, if that makes sense. So this, whatever width this is, I marked the center line, and I'm going to position the push stick just to the left of that center line to advance it past the cutting surface. You don't want to use the push stick, or try to avoid using the push stick on the half closest to the fence. The reason being is that you don't want to, without getting too technical, you don't want to create a moment about the center of the piece that you're trying to cut out such that this board wants to try to rotate. Because if you do that, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, you run the risk of the back of this workpiece wanting to touch the back of the blade, then it goes flying back at you. So again, you don't want to cause rotation of this workpiece. So when you're pushing it across, if you're going to use, something like this, it's not so wide, you could use your hand. But let's say, it's narrower and you're using a push stick. You want to keep the stick, again, to the left of center. Let me just show you. Again, just so you don't create rotation around the center point that could cause the blade to want to come back in contact with the back of the, or cause the workpiece to want to come into contact with the back of the blade. But let me show you what I'm talking about. And again, with this piece, I would just use my hand, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Now, actually, what I use personally even more often than push sticks, and these are fine, I do use them for smaller pieces. I like these, I guess it's called a grr ripper, GRR ripper system. Literally, it's spelled GRR/ripper, so I guess it's a grr ripper system. Anyway, I like using this just because as I'm pushing the workpiece past the blade, I'm consciously also pushing it this direction against the fence. And also, you know, I don't have to worry so much about, again, creating that rotation as long as I keep it against the fence. In fact, what I often do when I put this down, I'll sit it down, go like that, and maybe back off a little bit, just so that it's on the fence, and then push the workpiece past it. Other nice thing about this is that if you're cutting, let's say, a thinner piece, let's say something like this, you know, you're really getting in there, I would definitely not use my hand. This system comes with an attachment, and you can actually even, let's say, loosen this piece, move this over, and you can see I've actually cut through some of these, so it works. And actually, the thinnest side, you can cut a really thin piece with this. It's about 1/8 of an inch on this side. But then also, once you get the side that you want, you know, next to the fence moved over, and I'm using this side here, the thicker side, to do that, you can adjust this stand so that you don't have to worry about holding it upright as you're cutting. Then you set your width, move it here, and across the blade. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you saw that dust, I forgot to connect my, I disconnected my dust collector and I forgot to plug it back in. I had to move my boom stand to the other side. Let me try that again, just so you don't think saw stop is terrible with dust collection. Okay, take 2 with the grr ripper, ripping a piece of MDF over my saw stop table saw to show how this thing works. And now I have my dust collection hose attached, so hopefully it'll be better with dust control. There you go. A little better. Again, I really like this system. Push sticks are fine. I do use them. But these, I feel, allow me a little more control. I'm less worried about what happens to the back of the workpiece once it gets past the blade, because I can control it through the whole cutting process. And again, for really thin stocks, which I tried with this, so you don't get, let's see, this thing happening. Less of a worry with this. And again, you can even move this over and cut, you know, an 1/8 of an inch piece of lumber over your table saw with your hands completely protected from the saw blade. Okay, so the last thing I will say on ripping, something that I do, and I'll do this even if I'm using something like this, or especially when I'm using my hand, I'll show you. When I'm pushing the workpiece past the, past the blade, I tend to hold on to, I keep my hands kind of holding on to the fence a little bit. Not just like this or whatever. I tend to kind of want to hold it onto the fence. Maybe it's just psychological, but again, if something gets ripped out of my hand or whatever, I feel like if my hand is kind of holding onto the fence, there's less of a likelihood of my hand wanting to maybe out of, I don't know, instinct, follow the workpiece across the blade. I mean, I have a saw stop, but still, I don't want to have to use it, ever test it with my hand. So when I'm cutting a piece, again, I'll show you what I'm talking about. I kind of hold on to the fence just so that, if something gets ripped out of my hand, my fingers might just go like that, but my whole hand's not going to follow it. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I cut my little guy in half almost, but anyway, you get the idea. I just kind of hold on to the fence a little bit versus like this or whatever, just so you have something else holding your hand in place. Okay, the next topic I want to talk about are crosscuts. And I have a couple of miter fences that I use. I have a couple of these aftermarket that I purchased. Of course, I have the miter fence that I purchased along with my saw stop that I added this piece of Baltic birch onto just so I can get a little closer to the blade than the fence itself would allow me to get. And I also use a miter sled, or a crosscut sled, I should say, that I made. There are all sorts of these things out there, plans I know I've seen. I bought some from woodworking supply stores and whatnot, but this one I ended up just making. And I really like this use of a sled versus a miter fence. Although they both have application, but if you're cutting a smaller piece and repeatability in terms of cutting length is very important, I find that I'm able to accomplish that goal with a miter sled a lot easier than with a miter fence using some other type of tool or accessory. For instance, if I'm needing to cut a certain piece or pieces, let's say at a fixed length, once I figure out where I want to cut or the right length for the one piece, it's very easy for me then to come in with a piece of scrap and clamp it in place. So I just, one after another, cut to the exact same length. So this allows me to easily do that. Again, I know there are attachments. I'll show you on my miter fence that work, but I like this because, and I guess you could fix the issue that I'm about to say with an auxiliary fence, as I put on my saw stop. but this piece of MDF provides a little friction for me, so pieces aren't sliding around as much. I don't feel that they are when I'm making the cuts, but let me show you what I'm talking about on this other accessory. You know, again, using a fence like this, you have this little drop-down flag that can accomplish the same goal. But again, this is a slicker surface, and I could use this T-slot and perhaps make something to hold the piece in place, provide a little more friction. But I have that with my miter sled, or I keep calling it miter, my cross-cut sled, and it works really nice. On my saw stop fence, it does have these drop-down stop flags, but you know, some of you might have read in a comment, I was talking to one of the guys about this. I mean, it's not much. I mean, this is metal, but this thing moves a little bit, and you know, in furniture making, that little bit can cause a lot of problems later. So if I'm cutting big lumber, 2x4, something, or you know, again, I'm working my way towards the final precise cut that I'm going for. I'll use this to get me in the neighborhood, but I might use something else to make the final dimensional cut that I'm looking for. Here's another accessory I like to use with my miter fence. There are a couple of clamps that I purchased at Rockler a while back, and I have a piece of wood here that I cut some holes into to help me use it. And what this allows me to do is, let's say, again, I've measured the length of stock that I want to cut this way, you know, and I figured out, you know, where the blade needs to go. This allows me to get the fence in place as a backstop and then just cut, repeat cut after another. And when you're using something like this, what you want, actually I just showed you why you want to do this. You want to, you know, get your reference point set and then have this piece of wood positioned on the fence such that by the time you're cutting, the end piece is no longer in contact with the stop block. You don't need this fence and a fence on that side to do a cut. So, but this is, I use this a lot. Again, I'm trying to make repeated cuts on length, let's say a table leg or whatever. I know I have the one end squared off. I'll put the block in place so I can just keep cutting. The next thing I want to talk about is the importance of having some sort of outfeed table to support longer pieces of lumber. Again, for obvious reasons. I mean, you're cutting a piece of lumber, you're going across. At some point, there will be more wood off the table than on the table that you have to hold down. And you don't want to be, this is my next subject, you don't want to be over the blade trying to hold a piece of lumber down. So some sort of outfeed table you're going to want, or something to support the wood as you're cutting it. The saw stop outfeed table that came, well, actually I purchased it with my saw. You know, it's nice to have, but you don't need something that fancy. For many years before I bought the saw stop, I had a rigid table saw that I bought, which worked great. And to go along with that, for many years, I had this thing, which I would come over and I would, I'm actually pointing the wrong direction. I would set it up, get the height right, and take this pin out, So as I pushed the stock, I didn't worry so much about the level, and it would support the wood. Let's see here. Something like this. Just so you get the idea. Actually, the height's not right. Again, my only point being, yeah, this is nice. I love it, but you don't need anything fancy, but you want something to support your work. Again, once there's more lumber off the table than on, so you don't have to use your weight or strength to hold the piece down. Again, that's an accident waiting to happen. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to stand at the table saw. Not like this. When you're cutting on a table saw, the only thing you want this part of your body to be doing from here up is advancing the wood past the blade. You don't want any part of this part, you don't want any part of your body up here being responsible for holding you upright. Again, that's an accident waiting to happen. Every part of your body responsible for holding you upright is your core down. So when I'm cutting, I put my leg like this underneath the saw, and I do whatever I'm going to do so that, I could do the little Tom Cruise Mission Impossible thing, which you don't want to do. But I don't need my arms to hold me upright because, again, something gets yanked out of your hand, you get distracted, slips or whatever. Bad situation. So again, you structure your body such that from here basically up, all that part of your body is doing is advancing the workpiece, and from your core down, that's holding you upright. So you're not putting weight on the table in the Y direction, if you will. You're only adding force in the X direction to advance the workpiece. Next thing I'll mention, it may be obvious to some, but it's worth mentioning it. There are these dials the dial for the angle of cut on your table saw. Don't use that to figure out the angle of cut. I use a little digital gauge like this. Again, I use that to get me in the neighborhood, but if I want a 45-degree cut, I'm going to use something I trust that's 45 degrees to measure the angle of the blade. The reason being, if you ever made like a picture frame or anything like that, 45 degrees is not the same as 44.9 degrees. It's just not. They sound close, but they're not the same. There's going to be variation in everything, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but again, you don't want to use, I don't care what the saw is or how much you pay for the saw. Don't use the guide on the saw to figure out the angle that you're actually cutting at. Find some other tool that you can use, and usually I put it on this side, but you couldn't read it. Reference it, make sure your 0 point, and then set this so that this is not on a tooth, but it's flat, and then figure out your 45-degree angle, or 35, 37, whatever it is, and use that to tell you what the angle of cut is and not what the table saw says. Because if you are cutting even 90 degrees, whatever it is, that angle is very important if you're making like furniture or something like that. And if you're off a little bit, you will notice it once you start assembling your piece of your piece of woodwork. And last, but definitely not least, don't ignore that little voice in your head when it starts to tell you something doesn't feel right. And I mean that in all seriousness. I trust my intuition, especially in situations like this. You know, woodworking is about focus, being present and focus what you're doing, not trying to get too distracted. And if you're about to make a cut, and perhaps you've already been here, and that blade's humming or that router bit's turning around, and that feeling you have is not the feeling that says, this is the first time I've ever done this, and you know, it's kind of exciting, I'm making woodworking furniture or whatever, you know, there's something new, I hope it works out, you know, I hope the cut works out the way I want. It's not that sort of, I don't know, that little voice anxiety. It's more like, am I about to start bleeding here? Or am I going to lose something or whatever? If you have that little voice going on in your head saying, you know, something's not right, stop. Maybe you need to cut back and again, ease in on the cut and not try to go for the final cut. Maybe you should remove more wood in a rough fashion before you do the final cut. Maybe you need to add a clamp to something to hold it when you're about to make the cut. You know, maybe you need to build a jig, and if you're being honest, you're rushing, so you should shut the shop down, sleep, wake up tomorrow, make that jig, and then continue your project, whatever the case is. But seriously, if you have that little voice in your head saying something's not right, I listen to it usually if that happens to me. Funny story. Before I got really into woodworking years ago, I was into boating. I've had a few boats in my life. And I started out boating the West Coast, whatever, a small 20-foot bayliner. I got a bigger boat when I moved to Massachusetts way back when. It had a 26-foot Sea Ray on Narragansett Bay. And I wanted to take the boat out one day to Martha's Vineyard. I wanted to see what it's like to go to Martha's Vineyard. And I had a slipmate at the time, Gene, next to me. And I said, you know, Gene, what do you think? You think I can make it to Martha's Vineyard in this boat? Oh, he said, the boat will make it. You could definitely make it. But plan your trip. I had a chart plotter, no radar. That boat wasn't that big. And yeah, your boat will definitely make it to Martha's Vineyard. The question is, are you ready to go? And he said, if you want to find out, because one day I went down to the boat and I was going to go, should I go today, whatever? So you know what? Get your stuff ready, fill it with gas, go out of the sound, out into open water, and when you get out there, you'll know if you can make it. So I got my sandwiches and whatnot, I got my gas and things like that, filled my tank up. I head out of the sound, I got out to open water in the Atlantic, and I wasn't feeling it. And so about an hour or so later, I'm coming back to my slip. I see Gene there with a beer, big smile on his face, laughing. And he said, not today, huh? I'm like, yeah, no, not today. You know, I eventually took the boat to Block Island. So if you're familiar with that part of the U.S. and boating, the Atlantic is rougher than the Pacific. So I made it to Block Island, but I planned for it. But nonetheless, I got out there, and that voice in my head said, not today. And I went back to the slip. And I didn't care if Gene was going to laugh at me, which he didn't, smile on my face, whatever. But again, same thing with woodworking especially, because you want to keep these, you want to keep your eyes, your hearing and whatnot. You don't want to lose your mind with solvents and things like that. Safety is important, and a big part of safety, I think, is listening to that whatever spidey sense is that goes off and says, you know what, this doesn't feel right. And when that happens, stop, figure out why you had that feeling, might be for a good reason, and come up with a solution and then continue on so you can keep having fun. All right? And once again, thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. If so, please subscribe to my channel so you can receive notifications of future content. And so long for now.